Hey, everybody. The new Iraqi president, Ali al-Zaidi, was in the White House today, and we're going to cover that and talk about this visit and some of the things that were said there, some of the things and President Trump also made a statement about Iran in the context of the Iraq discussion that was very interesting, both in terms of his Iran strategy and in terms of Iraq. Now, I made a video recently about Iraq, about this new prime minister. You should make sure you go check out that video. Gives a little bit more background that I mentioned in that video that this visit to Washington was going to be coming up. And here it is today. So we are covering the story. Let's start with a few short clips from President Trump and the Prime Minister of Iraq, Ali al-Zaidi, in the Oval Office today. Here we go.
Please, Mr. President. Thank you. أشكر حفاوة الاستقبال إلى فخامة الرئيس دونالد ترامب.
Thank you for the warm welcome by His Excellency President Trump.
وهذه هي زيارتي الأولى.
This is my first visit
إلى الولايات المتحدة
to the
الأمريكية.
United States of America.
فهذه الزيارة لم تكن زيارة عابرة.
This visit was not just like any visit.
وإنما زيارة إعلان الشراكة اقتصادية.
Rather, it's an announcement of economic partnership.
تحدثت مع فخامة الرئيس.
Where I talked to His Excellency.
30/9 سوف تخرج القوات
By
الأمريكية.
the 30th of September, the U.S. forces will be out of Iraq.
وسوف تدخل الشركات الأمريكية.
While the U.S. companies will be inside Iraq.
ودائما تخلق العلاقة المجتمعية هي الشراكة الاقتصادية وليس العسكرية.
The social relations is about like economy, it's not like about like military relations.
أنقل تحياتي.
I would convey my greetings
من أقدم حضارة في
from
العالم.
the oldest civilization in the world.
إلى أكبر قلب اقتصادي في العالم
biggest
وتكنولوجيا.
economic and technology heart in the world.
وأكرر شكري إلى فخامة الرئيس على حفاوة الاستقبال.
My thanks to His Excellency the President for the warm welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, I'm not sure how clear that was for you. Let me just make sure that everyone heard what was said here. So this was the opening statement of Ali al-Zaidi. This was not response to any question. The questions are going to start right after this. So that's why it's actually significant what he said, what he chose to mention in this very short minute and a half opening statement before taking questions. Because what did he do? He basically said, thank you for the warm welcome. This is my first time in the United States. The visit is about economic partnership. And then immediately after saying that, he said, and I talked to His Excellency, I talked to President Trump, and by the 30th of September, U.S. forces will be out of Iraq, and U.S. companies will be inside Iraq. And then he ended with some platitudes. The only definitive thing he said in his statement, in his opening statement, was that he came here for economic reasons. And by the 30th of September, the United States will be out of Iraq because, again, the United States has set this date, September 30th, to remove all of their troops from Iraq. And that's what he emphasized. Now, why did he emphasize exactly that? Because in Iraq, the whole issue of disarming all the militias is tied in with the United States forces withdrawing. Most of Iraq today is Shiite. That doesn't mean that most of them are pro-Iran, but they're not anti-Iran, and there are a lot who are pro-Iran. It's not the friendliest of nations. On the other hand, the Shiites fought alongside the Americans against ISIS to get rid of ISIS in Iraq after the Saddam Hussein fell. So there's been this working relationship with the Shiites there. And Ali al-Zaidi, this new prime minister, was appointed by that Shiite bloc that appointed him as prime minister because their first choice, President Trump, would not allow to serve. Go back and watch that other video I made about Iraq for more of the background information. Okay, so he's emphasizing in this statement that the American troops will be gone because that's what the Iraqi people want to hear. They want to hear that the United States is going to be out of Iraq. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a signal that, yay, we've gotten the Americans. This isn't pulling out of of Afghanistan and giving it over to the Taliban. He's signaling that the militias need to go. Let me explain. Well, you know what? The best way to explain it is let's first watch a little bit more of this press conference. There's a little bit more to say. Okay, we're going to watch a couple more minutes.
Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I have a question for the Prime Minister.
Go ahead,
One
please.
to you, sir. If you allow me, I'm going to ask in Arabic. سمو سعادة رئيس الوزراء، هناك طلب أمريكي لحصر سلاح الميليشيات بيد الدولة وكبح جماح إيران وعدم مهاجمة دول الجوار. هل هذه أهداف يمكن أن تتحقق قبل سبتمبر؟ And Mr. President, if I may,
Who you with?
I'm with Al Arabiya. I cover the Middle East and the White House correspondent. I'm the foreign
Okay.
Sir, is the military attack on Iran, is this a strategy to bring him back to the table, or is it to degrade them so the regime will eventually fall?
Okay, the question she asked President Trump is the renewed attacks on Iran now meant to bring them back to the negotiating table, or is it meant to degrade them to the point that the regime will fall?
Well, we don't think we need the military there anymore. You know, it's a very a big operation. And what we do have is the oil companies are all going in now, and they're doing partnerships with Iraq, and they're getting along very well. The relationship is a whole big relationship where we don't need the military there. We're there to help them. We're there to protect them if need be, but we don't think that's going to be necessary. And their primary, I consider an opponent. They might have considered a friend, but I consider that an opponent was Iran, was a big burden on Iraq because they were the bully of the Middle East, as you know. And
You notice he just said they might have considered them a friend, but I consider them their opponent, because the Iraqis always have to play footsie with the Iranians and are somewhat aligned with them, and are somewhat friendly with them. Heavy Shiite population. Ever since the fall of Saddam, Iraq has been heavily influenced by the Iranians. It's been almost like a Lebanon type situation where the Iranians, this outside state, through their proxies that are part of the government and part of the local militia. It's not structured exactly the same way in both places, but it's the same template that Iran basically wields a lot of influence to the point of really controlling the government in Iraq, similar to what they've had in Lebanon for all these years. And so Trump is saying to the Iraqis, it's time to really step away from that. But they also know that this al-Zaidi, one of his goals is to move away from the Iranian influence, but do it in a way that does not tear the Shiite coalition apart. But now Trump is going to say something very interesting about the Middle East, about Iraq, and he calling Iran the bully of the Middle East. What I found interesting about this little clip is that in the way Trump's talking about this situation, he really kind of lays out, kind of explains the underlying logic of what he's doing in the Middle East beyond Iraq, what he's really doing in the Middle East right now with Iran, what his real goal is. It's interesting.
we were just talking about that, but they're not going to have that problem anymore because Iran has been very much destabilized, and really their military power is just a tiny fraction of what it was just 4 months ago. So they're not going to have that problem. I think it's really, in a sense, it's given them freedom to do what they have to do. And I think that's one of the reasons that our oil companies are going in there at levels that have never been seen before. So.
Okay. We have got to unpack this. I thought it was very interesting. You know, President Trump doesn't, lay out his policies in a systematic way that someone, delivering a briefing would. He just kind of lets these comments drop. He talks about giving them their freedom. He says, here we are, we're degrading the Iranians, and we're bringing American companies into Iraq to invest. And that is giving the Iraqis the opportunity. It's giving them a chance to step away from Iranian influence. Again, the combination of weakening the Iranian regime. He says they're not going to have to worry about that anymore. They're not going to have to worry about Iran being the bully of the Middle East. You're not going to have to worry about living under their thumb. And we're going to come in with big investments to keep you in our orbit to keep you away from Iran, to strengthen you so that you can liberate yourself from the clutches of the Iranian regime. That's the template. But now take a look at how Trump has approached Lebanon, how the Trump administration. Look at the deal that Marco Rubio brokered between Israel and the Lebanese government. The whole point of that deal was to look at Iran and say, you have no say in our internal affairs. So we think about dismantling the terror proxies as we think about it in terms of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the shipping of weapons, the control of these militias. But there's something else that's not exactly the proxies, but it is the proxies, but it's the political side of the proxies. The Houthis' control of southwest Yemen. I'm sorry, of northwest Yemen, northern Yemen, and the western part of the state. The Lebanese control, the Hezbollah control, which is really Iranian control of the Lebanese government. The Iranian control of the Iraqi government through the Shiite bloc. What Trump is doing here is we're degrading the Iranian regime, but also using diplomatic tools and economic tools, investment, etc., to incentivize these countries that have been under the colonial control, as it were, of the Iranian regime, Lebanon and Iraq, to liberate themselves, to give them the strength, give them the backing, give them the domestic incentive structure through economic deals that could create jobs and bring prosperity, to wrest them away from the Iranians as the Iranians are being degraded and weakened. I think that's actually the template for how Trump sees the Middle East going forward. I also feel very strongly with every passing day now, since Trump said, the ceasefire is basically over and started hitting again, that, and now with the return of the blockade, that Trump really is moving towards just causing the regime to collapse. And it could take a little bit longer, it could take a little bit shorter. It's not all about, which bombs are dropped, the strangling economically, but also these diplomatic moves, trying to pull away these countries, giving them their sovereignty, helping them achieve their sovereignty. Okay, let's go back to the clip. There's more here. Before we go back to the clip, let me just do our little public service announcement here. We're having a webinar. We're hosting a very important webinar this coming Monday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. in Israel. Are we headed for regime change? What to expect from the Middle East? This is an absolute all-star cast. It's, the 27 Yankees, Murderers Row. Look at this group. I'm going to be hosting, and we're going to have a panel with Brigadier General Amir Avivi, one of the top defense experts in Israel, founder of the Israel Defense and Security Forum. We have Brian Kennedy, former president of the Claremont Institute. We have Dr. David Wormser, senior analyst for Middle East Affairs at the Center for Security Policy, one of the top minds in the world. You're very familiar with him if you watch the videos we put up on Israel 365 News. We have him every week. And of course, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, one of the greatest analysts on Israel and the Middle East that you'll ever see. You've probably seen him on TV. And he's going to be joining us as well from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sign up for this webinar, even if you can't make it, because once you're signed up, you will get an email with the full webinar after the webinar airs. So even if you can't make it live, make sure to sign up. And you can only get that link by signing up. So go ahead and do that. The link is in the description of this video. Or you can, alternatively, you can click this QR code, and that's another way you can sign up. So the link in the description of the video is Israel365.com/regime. That's Monday, 1 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. in Israel. Okay, let's go back to the clip. Okay, let's remove that, and let's go back to the clip here. Here we are.
You want to answer?
Let's answer the question.
شكرا جزيلا على السؤال.
Thank you for your question.
ابتداء في منهاج الحكومي
According to the program of the government,
هو حصر السلاح بيد الدولة،
is to restrict the possession of weapons to the state.
وهذه نقطة أساسية
And this is a basic point.
ولدي قرار بها غير قابل للخيار.
And I have, and this is like a decision, it's not an option.
تم استلام
We received
أسلحة كثيرة من قبل بعض الفصائل،
weapons by different factions,
واللي يسلم سلاحه
and whoever surrender his weapon
ويتحول إلى جهة سياسية ومدنية.
turned into like a political or civilian.
من ناحيتنا سيتم التعاون معه.
We will cooperate with them.
بعد 30/9
After the 30th of September,
لا حاجة لوجود أي
there's
فصائل،
no any need for the presence of any faction,
لكون الفصائل
because factions
هي حاجة وليس محنة،
is a need, it's not a profession.
وماكو مبرر لبقائهم بعد
There's no
30/9.
any justification for their existence after the 30th of September.
إن شاء الله نهاية هذا العام أو بداية العام
So hopefully
القادم
by the end of this year or by the beginning of the next year,
سوف نعلن أكبر مؤتمر السيادة الوطني.
the sovereignty conference is the biggest conference in the region.
قرار العراق بيد العراقيين،
The Iraqi decision is by the hand of the Iraqis only,
وقواتنا الأمنية قادرة على حماية
and
أراضيها.
our security forces are capable of protecting their borders.
بعد
So
30/9
after the 30th of September,
لا نسمح لأي جهة تحمل سلاح خارج
we
نطاق الدولة.
never accept for any entity to carry weapons outside the control of a state.
Okay. This was huge. Just in case you missed it, let me do a quick review of what he said here. Okay. So he said, he was asked about weapons only being in the hands of the state, meaning the disarming of all the militias in Iraq. And he says that according to the program of the government, it's a very basic point that the only weapons can be in the hands of the state, meaning all the militias have to be disarmed. But then he says something very interesting. He says, after the 30th of September, there's no need for the presence of any faction. And this is an exact quote, because factions are a need, not a profession. There's no justification for their existence after the 30th of September. What on earth is he talking about? Now, he said the same thing in an interview with Sharq al-Awsat, which is a major Saudi media outlet. He made a similar statement in an interview. So I dug up the interview. It's a very long interview. I'm just going to read you this one section. And this is from a few weeks ago. Has the government negotiated with factions that reject confining arms to the state? What if their rejection becomes final after their withdrawal? Would the government be forced to confront them? In other words, think Hezbollah in Lebanon, state wants to disarm them. But in Iraq, you have a whole bunch of different factions, like half a dozen different Shiite factions who are all sort of part of the state, the same way Hezbollah is sort of part of the state in Lebanon, or was for many years. And now they're looking to disarm all of them. And he's basically being asked, what happens if any of them refuse to disarm by the deadline that you set? Then what do you do? And they all have to be disarmed before the Americans will leave. So any faction that refuses to disarm is going to be viewed by the Iraqi people as causing the Americans to remain. So he set the deadline for the disarming of the factions as September 15th. Okay, that's the deadline he set, if I'm not mistaken. So here's his answer. Let us state this clearly. There is no force other than the force of the state, and we will use the force of the law to impose it. There will be no weapons other than the weapons of the state. Some view the plan to confine arms to the state as little more than a symbolic measure adopted to accommodate political forces. If we listen to the skeptics, we will never reach a result. As for the factions, they are ideologically driven groups. We believe that their publicly declared acceptance of giving up their weapons is an important and significant beginning. In reality, we have received various types of weapons from Saraya al-Salam, Asaib al-Haq, and Kataib Imam Ali. These are three different Shiite groups. He's giving examples of Shiite groups that they've already received weapons from. More important than the handover of weapons, however, is severing the relationship between a faction and the fighters under its command. We can't have fighters running around, or we can't have a violent faction that actually has fighters. The weapons of these factions are now effectively in the custody of the state. Only a small quantity remains. A mechanism will soon begin for handing over the remaining weapons to the armed forces. This file will be addressed in its entirety. Nothing is stronger than the state. We believe that resistance is a necessity, not a profession, and the need for it has ended. Now, what is he referring to here? Resistance is a necessity, not a profession, and the need for it has ended. And then we saw similar language in this little interview clip sitting in the Oval Office, where when he was talking about disarming factions, he said, after the 30th of September, there's no need for any presence of any faction because factions is a need, not a profession. There's no justification for their existence after the 30th of September. Let me explain what he's actually saying. He's saying that resistance, now what is resistance in Shiite language in the Middle East today? Resistance is resisting the Americans, resisting the Israelis. Iran refers to its proxy network as the axis of resistance. So he's saying resistance is a necessity. It's a need. It's not a profession. It's not something you do permanently. And after September 30th, when the Americans leave and there's no Americans to resist anymore, there's no need for any factions. There's no need for your weapons, meaning if the Americans are staying, we understand why you're still resisting, but why you still want your weapons to be a terrorist group, to be part of the resistance. But if the Americans are gone, why do you still exist as a faction? Who are you fighting? Oh, you're an enemy of the state. You're a destabilizing factor in the state. It's just like the logic behind Hezbollah being allowed to keep their weapons in the Taif agreement at the end of the Lebanese Civil War. At the end of the Lebanese Civil War, when they negotiated the end of that war, the agreement was that Hezbollah could retain its weapons, even though weapons are supposed to be in the hands of the state. They could retain their weapons for the purpose of the resistance against Israel across the border, across the southern border of Lebanon. So similarly, the similar logic is at work here. What he's saying is everyone has to give up their weapons. You might argue you need them to resist the Americans, to fight the Americans. But after September 30th, when the Americans are gone, you don't need your weapons anymore. Okay? That's the logic behind what he is saying here. Now, he also mentioned a conference. You notice he said that we will be convening a sovereignty conference. What is he talking about? So this is really interesting. He made this announcement in the same interview, somewhere else in the interview, but here's a short report of it. Iraqi PM announces sovereignty conference on arms monopoly. Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi said that his government will convene a national sovereignty conference by the end of the year to cement the state's exclusive control over arms, while aiming to complete the disarmament of factions by September 30th. He noted that the conference would formally establish the only state and its security force, that only the state and its security forces have the right to bear arms. There will be no armed groups outside the framework of the state. You know, let me actually find where he talks about the conference in here. I think that's almost an exact quote. Here it is. Here, at the end of the year, we will announce a national sovereignty conference that will enshrine the exclusive possession of force by the state. Yeah, that's what they say here. Now, what is this about? What is this sovereignty conference? Well, what he wants to do is call a conference where other states, remember he said it'll be a regional conference, where other states will come to this conference to all support and declare their support for the independent sovereignty of Iraq. What does it mean, independent sovereignty? Aren't they a sovereign nation? No. What it means is free of the influence of foreign nations, free of the influence of, for example, Iran. Here, you know, we should actually take a look at what he says. Here, there's this opinion piece that was also in Sharq al-Awsat. So Sharq al-Awsat is a Saudi outlet, and you'll see why this matters in a moment. And this is an opinion piece by a well-known Saudi journalist, Mishari Daidi, and it was done a few weeks ago. It was done July 1st, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. And what he says here, he's praising Zaidi for all the moves he's making. And then at the end of it, he says as follows: one major issue remains. and it's just as problematic as corruption, if not even more so. The question of bringing weapons under state control, reclaiming the decision of war and peace, and preventing Iran from using Iraqi territory to attack neighboring countries, especially the Gulf states and Jordan. Al-Zaidi acknowledged the problem. He said he had asked neighboring countries to provide evidence, meaning evidence of attacks from their territory, and he had instructed the security chiefs to be firm on the matter. But he closed with a telling statement. I urge, however, that the present not be judged through the lens of the past. We found the situation already in place when we assumed responsibility. It is in our people's interest to build distinguished relations with the international community, neighboring countries, Arab Gulf states. Iraq is a state, not a village, al-Zaidi stressed. If he succeeds in purging Iraq of the major figures of corruption and their networks and freeing it from the militias loyal to Iran's Revolutionary Guard that prey on Iraq's sovereignty and its ties with its neighbors, then the people of Iraq, indeed the people of the region, will carve his name alongside the noble immortals. What this guy is saying is that getting Iraq independent of Iranian influence is the goal here. The Saudis, Sharq al-Awsat is a Saudi outlet. The Saudis are building up this idea. They're promoting him. This big interview where he revealed this idea of a national sovereignty conference. They want to bring heads of state from the region together, and they want to just kind of, it's all going to be a festival of support for Iraqi sovereignty and calling all of the militias to submit to one Iraqi sovereignty and free of Iranian influence. And the Saudis are going to be investing in this. The Americans are going to be investing in this. This is part of dismantling Iran's influence in the region, but it's also how Iraq will achieve its sovereignty. One last thing is that a sovereignty conference like this has actually already been suggested 6 years ago, and it never went anywhere. Let me show you this interesting story I dug up. So look at this. Parliament calls to hold an international conference to support Iraqi sovereignty. This is from 2020. Al-Fatah MP Hamid al-Musawi intended to submit a request to the Parliament presidency to adopt an international conference to support Iraqi sovereignty. And he calls on a global conference to be held in Baghdad and come out with international support for Iraqi sovereignty, in addition to concluding agreements with the countries during the conference, stipulating the commitment of all to the unity and sovereignty of Iraq and its removal from the arena of international conflicts. In other words, stop dragging us into other wars. This is a way of saying getting rid of Iranian influence. He added that the international conference will be a valuable opportunity to support the world in making the year 2020 the year of Iraqi sovereignty. This was in January of 2020. He said this. So this idea that was floated by this MP 6 years ago is now suddenly in the offing to have a conference that supports Iraqi sovereignty. But you see here, that's why what I said about Trump's overall strategy in the Middle East being represented by this moment with Iraq. He gets his new guy into Iraq, brings him over to the United States, sits down, says, okay, we're going to cut you all kinds of deals. We're going to have American companies going over there to invest in your infrastructure, to invest in your oil companies. There's a lot of money there, and we're going to help you stabilize. If you're saying that you can only disarm the militias if we leave, fine. We're going to set a date, September 30th. We're out of there, but you have to have the militias disarmed. And the entire thrust of the diplomacy and of the pressure is to disengage from Iranian influence. It's the same playbook as Lebanon, although it's a different situation, so it plays out a little bit differently. But I think you can see the underlying thought process of Trump's foreign policy in the region through this event. Okay, all right, folks, that's it for this one. Please make sure to sign up for the webinar. The link is in the description of the video, or you can go to Israel365action.com and sign up there. All right, God bless.